because if it's done right, it's the enabler, it's the driver for psychological safety and operational excellence. In other words, quality, safety, effectiveness, efficiency, productivity, interactions and engagements with your workforce, interactions and engagements with your stakeholders. All of those things happen as the result of deploying HOP correctly. And oh, by the way, some of them don't happen if you don't deploy HOP correctly. So I put together about 5 HOP deployment problems, and then I'll talk about each one. The first one is that we've trained leaders. They're on board, but they're actually not driving the improvements. You hear things like, I support HOP, or I'm a big supporter of HOP from the leadership, but they're not educated enough and they haven't had to alter their behaviors enough to actually drive the improvement. Second one is the tools for the workforce either were never rolled out or they were rolled out ineffectively. And we'll do some talking about tools. The next one is that the organization thinks that HOP can really be done with little or no education or training, especially for the workforce. And when an organization thinks that, they tend to focus on areas that really aren't benefiting the people that might get hurt, maimed, and killed. In other words, they deploy without integrating, and that really results in very few sustainable positive outcomes. You may see some blips, but then the next leader comes in and you don't see the outcome hanging around. And the last one, probably the most important, even though these are usually in no particular order, leaders don't use a system or process for leading human organizational performance. In other words, there's no intentionality behind their HOP leadership. It's just part of the other things they're doing. You go out in the field, you ask a leader specifically what concept they're deploying, they can't tell you. But remember, even if you go back to Deming, he says knowing what to do is not enough. It's knowing how to do it that makes the difference. And I'm going to say this not as a plug, but as a reality. When I was back in an organization, the leaders didn't have a lot of tolerance for me teaching them what they should do. They didn't mind me giving them information. They didn't mind me telling them the whats, but the hows, I'm not them. The hows almost always need to come from someone external that has experience. They need to understand how to do the things that leaders need to do to make HOP work for the sustainable future. And in order to do that, there's some things that the leaders have to be educated on. And what I've done here is I've just highlighted the things that are actions or things they need to do. They need to be educated on the HOP principles. Almost everybody does that, but they're usually not educated on how to use them. They need to be educated on the science and the practical applications. In other words, what are we supposed to see and do in our organization as leaders? How do I know if people are doing the right things out there? And how do I know if my leadership team is doing the right things? In other words, they need to understand the methods, processes, and tools of human and organizational performance. They need to understand the leaders' roles and responsibilities. We call them R2A2, and you may see some of this in some DOE work. Roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, and authorities. That goes all the way up through the leadership team. So you don't have a vice president that doesn't understand their role and responsibility for what's going on with human and organizational performance. And then they get leader tools. Now, in a lot of rollouts, everybody talks about it not being about the worker, but they don't give tools to the leaders. And the reality is it's about everybody. So if you're going to give the workforce and the managers and the supervisors the tools to do what they need to do, the leaders need tools as well, because they have some new knowledge, language, and behaviors that are going to make it work. And they have some bad knowledge, language, and behaviors that are going to make it fail. And they need to understand the importance of that And that education is step one, step two is integration, and step three is sustainability. So, how are we going to use the people that are really doing the work in the organization? So the leaders have to understand what are the roles and responsibilities. How can we do advocate utilization so that we've got a whole bunch of subject matter experts in the field that can help us in our 3 or 4 questions deep. And then that becomes the difference between empowering people, telling them what they should do, and enabling people, giving them the capability and capacity to do those things. And what I mean by driving is if you look at this race car, Kellogg's is a sponsor. We hear, yes, we've got a management sponsor. Yes, we've got a leadership sponsor team. Well, Kellogg sponsors this call. They don't make it successful. All they do is write the check and provide the resources. But if you look closely in that picture, there's a guy in there called Rick Hendrick who owns Hendrick Motorsports, and they have about 5 cars. There's a huge difference between sponsoring HOP and driving it. Rick Hendrick, Hendrick Motorsports, they make sure that the driver, the crews, the manufacturers have everything that they need, and they know as much about racing that vehicle as the people that are involved. And you can look around at different organizations and you can see the difference between sponsoring or uh, making sure that they support HOP and actually driving it. When they're used the right way, help all levels of the organization. So very recently, a few months ago, I was approached by somebody and they went and got certified in HOP and a certified HOP trainer, and they were excited about it. I said, that's great. They said, but then I got home and I talked to my dad. And my dad is a worker at a factory that had human performance deployed there 15 years ago. And I started talking about all this HOP stuff that I learned. And my dad said, yeah, I know about that. I know about how to recognize when you're vulnerable. I use the traps and the tools every single day. We brief them on the floor. We use the tools to help us reduce probability. And she looked at him and said, you've been using them for 15 years? I said, yeah, they still work. So here we are, 15 years down the road, with a parent telling their daughter something works. There's other people out there telling you they don't work and you don't need them. And I remember years ago, and some of you have read my book, know this story. There was an old crusty pipe fitter, and they knew he was about to retire. He'd been with the company about 40 years. And the only thing had changed was the size of his overalls. He'd brought the same lunchbox to work every day. And then one day he got assigned to go help do a task. And the reason they were assigning him is that they did this task every 18 months and they screwed it up every 18 months or so. So they knew from the previous times they may need a pipe fitter. So he was just there to stand around. And the 2 electricians were they had to crawl down through this pipe chase, and then they could stand up and start working on what they were working on. Well, the one of the electricians said to the other, I think we're supposed to land this jumper now, aren't we? And the other one said, yeah, I'm pretty sure we are. And the first one said, yeah, that's what I remember. We talked about it in the pre-job brief, didn't we? And the other said, yeah, I think we did. Oh, crusty pipe fitter. Now remember, he was in the very last training class for workers that was done at this facility of about 2,000 people. They just didn't think he would accept it or get it. Old crusty pipe fitter says, well, it sounds to me like y'all are in that knowledge mode. And I think you need to stop and figure out whether you're right or not. He said, oh, we're right. We're right. And he said, well, y'all may be right, but I'm going to crawl on out of here because I don't want to find out whether you're right or wrong by something bad happening. And he starts crawling out of the pipe chase. Well, they crawled out after him. They go to the frontline supervisor and he looks at him and says, what are y'all doing here? And the crusty pipe fitter just smiled. And the 2 guys said, well, we were about to land this jumper. And he said that we weren't right. And he said, that's not what I said. Y'all sent me to training 2 weeks ago that said, if you hear people say, I think, I believe, or I'm pretty sure, you need to stop and get help. And that's what y'all said. So they put the scenario out for the frontline supervisors, and frontline supervisors said, well, I think you guys are right. We did talk about it in the pre-job brief. And then Krusty Pipefitter kind of threw up his hand and said, here we go again. So the supervisor pulls down the prints and pulls out the procedure. What he discovered was, had they landed that jumper at that time, before they removed control power to these two other things, it would have sent a signal to a deluge system that is designed to flood that pipe chase in 1 minute. But the tools don't work. Workers don't need them. They don't need the ability to recognize their vulnerability. And I got to tell you, from a personal perspective, the two young electricians, they may have been able to swim their way out of there, but I don't think Krusty Pipefitter would have made it out. So there are a ton of stories that back up the need for tools at the workforce level. Here's your top 5 HOP go-dos. Educate the leaders and give them the new language and behaviors you want them to use every day, so they're driving the improvements. The next one is to roll out the right tools, very deliberate, very intentionally, and based on the science. We know what ones work. We know how they work. We know what tool works for what thing, and we know how many really do work. So there needs to be some intentionality behind it. You need to design and deliver your workforce education and training based on proven models. I can't tell you the amount of times I've watched organizations struggle for years with how they're going to train the workforce when people already know what works in training the workforce. But this whole not invented here in the HOP space just means you're going to be two shiny objects down the road before you're ever ready to try to put it out there. And then at your facilities, at your company, at your sites, form an integration team of advocates and leaders that will tell you how to put it into day-to-day work. How do our daily management boards fit in? Where does this fit into our daily management boards? Where does it fit into our tail boards? Where does it fit into our leadership morning meetings? The workforce, once they're educated, the workforce has all kinds of ideas on how you can get people to use it every day. And let's go back to the family story from earlier. That individual was able to show his daughter exactly how they discussed it in their morning meetings and talk about when they stopped and had another discussion during the day. That's 15 years after they deployed the concepts. And then you have to start leading with intentionality based on the science and go out and do values-based engagement.